Amanda, I'm actually not quite sure where to start with you because your practice is multidisciplinary to a point that I rarely encounter. So perhaps where I can start is around that very question of the extensiveness of your practice. And just to note that you have, in the last 14 years or so, you have explored experimental film, you have explored dance and performance, and installational practices that also include audio and video. So that's a very brief romp through the incredible complexity of your practice. But all that considered, since your practice is so extensive, the question that came to me as I was thinking about that was, well, you know, artists are understood to do certain things or to be a certain way. And perhaps in many respects that's an older notion when it's specified as a particular kind of practice. And since you don't have a particular kind of practice in the older sense, I'm kind of curious about, and I'd be interested to know from your perspective, what, threading our way through these practices, constitutes for you an idea of what an artist can do?
For me, as my practice has evolved, it's actually, ironically, the more broad my practice becomes, the more clear it becomes for me. And then I start to see my role as an artist having more to do with listening than speaking. And so, for example, and I don't mean listening physically with my ears, I mean metaphorically, and being open to follow where my subject takes me. I've started to see my creative practice as a mode of research. And I look at the way that traditionally, you know, research is seen as specific things, you know. You do experiments, you gather statistical, quantitative data, anecdotal, qualitative data. But I see my creative practice, my artistic practice, as an alternative form of research that's just as valid as kind of the academic quantitative qualitative approach. So probably the easiest example is my work on the RCI radio towers I've done for the past 9 years. And rather than starting with a message like I'm going to tell people about this site, I'm going to tell them about the history, or I'm going to make a political commentary, I find that, you know, when I was younger, I might have started with, you know, a message or something I wanted to convey. And in hindsight, I feel like that often makes for work that's more narrow and constrained. And so by approaching my art practice with the idea of listening and hollowing myself out to become a conduit and allow my subject to take me where it wants to take me, it often takes me into very uncomfortable territory, maybe into disciplines I'm not trained in, maybe into things that are terrifying and disgusting. Like for this project with the radio towers, I got my climbing certification and I climbed 2 radio towers, 250 feet in the air. I also wound up working with bones and learning how to clean cow bone, which was actually quite disgusting. And so, yeah, that project is a good example in that it began with, I learned how to build a radio out of toilet paper tube and magnet wire, and I picked up Italian radio, and I thought, I did a great job. And I didn't. I just lived near these shortwave towers, and I found out people in the area got radio in their sink, and if they had copper pipes that acted like an antenna. And I was jealous because I didn't get radio in my sink, and you can't just go buy a Sony Syncman. So I decided I would try to build a radio with no electronic components, purely with plumbing. And it wound up being essentially a sculpture, even though I didn't see myself trained. I had a visual art background, but I didn't have a sculpture practice. So this, we're talking almost 10 years ago, I had this radio sink that I would take out on the marsh. So it became a site-specific intervention, a sculpture, but it was also a public performance because I would go out, and the town of Sackville is very small. It's about 5,000 people. I became a town character, and when I would go to the grocery store, the cafe, or the pub, people would ask me if I heard the radio in my sink yet. And they started telling me stories, and I would take it to agricultural fairs, to the fall fair. So it almost became a social practice as well. So all of a sudden, here I was with this sculpture, just because I was curious about how does someone hear the radio in their sink? This is bizarre. I had no grant. Every paycheck I would just go and spend another $80 on plumbing pipes. You know, some people smoke. I would go to the plumbing store and buy $80 of plumbing. Every 2 weeks I would get another 12 feet of pipe. And my sink grew, and it was a sculpture, site-specific installation, and essentially kind of social practice as I was engaging with people in the farming community who started telling me stories. And then I started recording the stories. And then I thought I should maybe make a film. And I wanted to do this landscape film of the towers in Four Seasons. And then Radio Canada announced they were going to tear the site down. And here I was with funding at this point to make this film. And I thought, no one's going to document the end. So I'm going to postpone finishing the film and include the demolition of the site in my film. But then as a result, the film, there's 2 years of waiting from when they stopped, 2012 to 2014. Nothing was happening. So I decided to do contact microphone recordings. And I would trespass onto the site through the marsh, put my microphones on the tower, and gather these recordings. And then there was this big hole behind in the public access road, and there were piles of dirt to prevent people from driving their pickup trucks into it, and 2 posts. And I felt compelled to hang a laundry line between, which kind of referenced, there was a family there on the marsh in the 50s, the Anderson farm. The mother would hear the radio on her clothesline when she would put her laundry out. She would hear the radio on her clothesline, and so all of a sudden I built this clothesline next to the radio towers. It wasn't meant to be an art project. I just felt compelled and I did it. And so to me, this is another example of just being open to following and listening. And I just took some photos with my iPhone at first, and over the course of the next year, no one ever took this down. It's on a public access road used by farmers, and this clothesline of white clothes was there, and every time I went, they'd be a little bit more ripped, a little bit more disheveled. And by the end of the year, the radio towers were torn down, and all the clothes on my clothesline were torn down. So all of a sudden, I had made this kind of public site-specific intervention that had intervened with it. So that became a photo series. And then there was the sound recordings, which then evolved into this really large-scale installation performance where I built a sculptural scale model of the RCI site with wires going through that conjure them, so when you touch them, you trigger sounds. And that was inspired by the fact that when I was working on the site, I was alone. I couldn't tell anyone that I was filming because they didn't want people to go steal scrap metal. So I was not allowed to post on Facebook or Twitter or anything. And I found myself in a position of witnessing a very historical event. So as an artist, because I started off with that sink and I already had a relationship with the site, I was the crazy sink girl. So I wasn't threatening when it came for the demolition. They knew me. I had access that a regular filmmaker might not have had access. But I wasn't allowed to tell anyone. So I was alone watching the demolition of this very important site and part of international communication infrastructure. And at the end, I had some very intense experiences of feeling like I was bearing witness. And it was the question of how do I share this with the public in a way that's, I had the film, but sometimes I didn't want, you can share certain things through stories and facts and history and quantitative and qualitative data, but some things like the emotional sensorial impact don't translate in literally in stories and didactic things. And so for me, the project Requiem for Radio, which is an installation and an interactive performance, that was my way to try and become a conduit to share the experiences that I had that didn't translate into words and facts and historical data and statistics. It was, how do I take these very intimate experiences I had, the years I had trespassing on that site, putting microphones on the towers, hearing the wind in the towers, bearing witness to the demolition of this site, which was a very intense experience. I mean, they're just big pieces of metal. They're inanimate objects, but there was a very, almost a supernatural, emotional kind of thing that happened that I can't put into words. And I wanted to find out, how do I share that with an audience? So to come back to your question of how I navigate all the different disciplines, as my process evolves, it's really, I just allow myself to be led by my practice. And so I found myself veering into the territory of computer programming. And I think my role as an artist is to not to be afraid to try things that maybe aren't my expertise. And when necessary, I work with mentors and advisors and find ways to navigate through. And I allow the subject to take me where it leads me. And just to be open and willing to go to those uncomfortable places. And maybe they're uncomfortable because the discipline's not my expertise, or maybe they're uncomfortable because I'm climbing 250 feet in the air in February, or maybe they're uncomfortable because I'm boiling cow bones and dish soap in my kitchen and it smells disgusting. But I just have to, as an artist, be open and willing to listen and let the subject dictate how I'm going to convey it.
Perhaps I can pick up on that word requiem.
Yeah.
And you talk about listening, Amanda. I'm putting the question of listening together with the question of requiem. And I wonder if there's a kind of mood that you feel runs through your practice that is something that you find important to convey or communicate, a mood. Let's say certain moods operate obviously in literature and the arts, like tragedy and comedy. When we come to listening and the requiem, is there a way that you can describe how you see these two meeting?
It's interesting. It makes me think of the ways other people have described my work that I found surprising. One person once told me that they saw a thread in my work that it was always about destruction, and I thought, oh, no, not at all. And I look back, I'm like, I did a piece on analog television, they stopped analog television broadcasts. I do the piece on radio, they tear down the site. So I'm almost afraid to start new subjects because it seems like whenever I start making artwork, the thing I've chosen gets destroyed. I like to take things apart to build them back up again. And in terms of mood, I think there's something, it's funny because I deal with a lot of technology and things that are traditionally seen as very cold, technological, mechanical, digital, and I tend to anthropomorphize them and imbue them with a sense of wonder and mystery and humanity. I don't necessarily believe in the supernatural, but somehow it always finds its way into my work, that there's this sort of element of the mystery, the unexplained, even though it's very technological and scientific. I'm really interested in kind of a sense of wonder. And more recently, these last projects, there's definitely a sense of loss. I think loss and wonder and wanting to bring back, I guess loss and wonder.
Bring back something of value.
Yeah, to reflect on what we've lost and maybe to make us think a bit more before destroying things in the future. Like, I can't stop us from losing the radio towers, but maybe I can make people think a little bit more before they destroy the next round of technology, whatever that's going to be.
So I do want to ask where all this came from. I remember a filmmaker, a very well-known filmmaker, when asked about his work, he said, everything that's in my work comes from before I was 6 years old. And I'm curious about this question of origin and whether you can track back into the long ago and how a trajectory worked towards, well, I guess Simon Fraser, for instance, in the development of your practice as you're developing it now, of course.
Yeah, I was always interested in art and science. My mom painted when I was a child. She still paints now. But I was always very interested in how things worked in science. You know, as a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. I was on the science team and I was a math tutor, but I was also dancing in a young company and training in dance and drawing and painting. And just today I was giving a presentation to a high school group of students in art and science. I specifically asked to present to art and science because when I was in high school I thought I had to choose art or science. And it was only later on in Vancouver when I was doing my master's and working at Emily Carr as a technician that I saw undergraduate students taking courses in creative electronics, and I thought, if only I'd known that 10 years earlier. For me, ever since the beginning, there's a desire to know how things work, and a sense of mystery and wonder of the universe. And my work with electrical stuff, I mean, it's more of a funny anecdotal story, but apparently as a child, like I grew up on a farm and we had an electric fence, and my brother and I would see who could get electrocuted the longest, instead of who can hold their breath the longest, who can hold the fence the longest. And we had, apparently as a toddler, I would also stick my fingers in the electrical outlets frequently. So I didn't realize this till much later on. I'm like, oh, maybe that has something to do with my interest in electricity. Maybe it goes back to being a toddler. But yeah.
That's hilarious. There's a few things that are being talked about in terms of your work that are really just word shots, you might say. But the words that have come up have been memory, identity, and physical sensation. I'm getting a sense that you've just touched on most of those characteristics as you've spoken. Would that triangulation between memory, identity, and physical sensation be a kind of core, do you think, that focuses your practices?
I think so. I think there's a lot, like when we talk physical sensation, there's a lot of it that has to do with the human body in relation to analog technology, and a bit more digital now, but so I'd say physical sensation in relation to the technology around us, because we're using technology all the time and we take it for granted. So my interest in physical sensation, a lot of it has to do with how we physically sense the technology and how the technology mediates our sensation of the world around us. And memory for sure, both personal memory and memory of technology, greater memory, the idea of history. And I think working with identity is almost inevitable. It comes into, it's how can one make work without addressing questions of identity.
And history. You obviously have a great interest in the history of technology, or the technologies that pass into history, I guess. Is history a really significant centralizing force in the work?
It's interesting because it's not intentionally central, but it has become central. Like when I started with the radio towers, I was interested in them as a formal structure, an intervention in the landscape that were beautiful and mysterious. And the more I started working with them and realized what their role was when they were built, I just became fascinated, and all of a sudden it became central. And then also the fact that I was documenting this moment, I realized that I was becoming a part of a very important historical moment. I was witnessing something historical that in the present moment, it was the present moment, but it was going to be historically important. And that I almost feel like I didn't have much choice. I feel like I was kind of happened to be at a certain place that was going to be, that then necessitated me to engage with the history of what came before and why this was significant. So now I definitely am much more interested in history, but it was not my intent. I just, again, it was a matter of listening and being open to following where it takes me. Yeah.
I wonder, Amanda, thinking about the practice that you've developed, I'll have to say that when we were having that fantastic description of the piece, that Wagner came to mind. And just as Wagner represented a watershed, you might say, how music could connect with history and theater and so on and so forth. It struck me that the piece that you've just completed, I guess you completed it, the radio towers, similarly seems to be a kind of, well, as they say in German, like a Gesamtkunstwerk. And I wonder, do you think that this is a hard question perhaps, but do you think that this particular practice has become part of the zeitgeist that we're in now. That if in the 1960s there was a very direct understanding of the material and one's dedication to that material, a singularity, you might say, whether the plurality, you might say, of this practice that you're developing might represent a more current dominant discourse or zeitgeist. That's a very long question. You can answer it any way you wish.
Yes, I think that we're in a period where a lot of artists are starting to work across disciplines. And I think I see sometimes this happens in kind of an authentic way where it's led by the subject and the artist pursuing modes of research or practice that necessitate this plurality. But I think we also just as often see people doing it because they feel like they're supposed to be multidisciplinary. And I find it a little bit heartbreaking and frustrating to see sometimes artworks that are multidisciplinary for the sake of being multidisciplinary. They're just like grabbing all these different media because they're like, oh, this is what contemporary art is now. And you're like, just a photo would have been fine. There's nothing wrong with making very simple conceptual work. And I think both are so important. So currently I just finished a massive complex work, but I'm really looking forward to making something much more concise very soon. So I think, the contemporary zeitgeist, there's definitely, there's a lot of artists working this way, and sometimes it comes from an authentic place of research where it's necessitated, but too often it's people, I don't know statistically which comes most, but there are definitely times when people do these multidisciplinary projects for the sake of it, and it's just, it doesn't do much for them. So, and I think that is because there's this idea that this is the trend, this is now, this is what we're supposed to be doing, this is contemporary art. But I think when it really works is when the project itself necessitates it, then it works. But if you're just doing it because it's what you think contemporary art is, it feels empty.
I'm going to ask this question then. I was going to ask it a bit later on, but I'm going to ask it right now because it follows. The question of the authentic is, you might say, perennial one. And you just touched on what might seem to be an important way of understanding the authentic, what is real, and that is what is necessary. Do you want to explore that at all in your own mind in terms of this relationship?
Yeah, and I think the authentic is something that I struggle with a lot, and I think that as my practice has evolved, it comes back to what I was talking about earlier, this idea of becoming a conduit and following the subject, but also even though a conduit hollowing oneself out, but to work with a subject that actually resonates with me as an artist. For an artist to work with something that initially resonates, not to just pick something because you're like, okay, well this is a topic that's hot now, I'm going to make work about this. No, I think that it is still important for artists to find things that resonate with them personally, but not to become too introverted and navel-gazing, to still make work that resonates personally, but then to follow it to both deep and wide, to go deep in the research, but then to allow it to go wide as well in the practice. And when I say wide, that's when I'm talking about cross-disciplinary, being like, okay, I've gone really deep in my research, maybe in this one medium, this one discipline that I'm very comfortable in, like my film. I'm very comfortable in my filmmaking practice, so I went very deep in that. And then I broadened it out, going into sound and computer programming and sculpture and social practice, which maybe not my primary area of practice. So to allow that research to go deep and to go wide, it's something that initially resonated with me personally, but then also at the same time, again, trying to hollow myself out and listen and to become a conduit. So for me, authenticity has as much about being true to yourself, but getting yourself out of the way too. I think it's important to get the self out of the way because there's too much risk for pride, narcissism, egoism, and it's a struggle, I think, often for not just artists, anyone, to take ourselves, to find that balance, to be true to yourself, but to get yourself out of the way as well. and to be like, okay, well then what is this thing, and how do I relate to it, and how does it relate to other people, and yeah, I'm not sure.
Research. There are some things that operate around us, Amanda, of course, as a professional artist, and the art system is the name for it. And I'm curious whether you have any thoughts about the art system. Of course, there are many art systems, but on the question of an artist's relationship to the systems of distribution, exhibition, and of course also career construction. Well, do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, there's so many systems. Is there a particular system you want to know about, or the general?
Well, I think that most people think in terms of, I suppose, the major international exhibitions and national exhibitions and exhibitions that occur at important institutions around the country. And all of the public relations and curatorial investments and critical responses that occur within that. So it's a general question rather than a specific.
Yeah, I think that this is where, especially when you look at a country the size of Canada, and you have large urban centers and then small rural areas that are more remote and in regions, you see the importance of the artist-run center as an institution, which has over time almost become itself institutionalized, in which then you have younger artists reacting against the artist-run center, which is supposed to be the counterculture. But the role of the artist-run center is very important in providing artists with space for research, experimentation, development of works. When it comes to things like the art market and commercial galleries and representation, I used to be very much opposed to it. I was opposed to the concept of commodified art objects that could enter into the capitalist system. I was very opposed to that. More recently, as I've been getting older, I've started realizing, I've met people who collect artwork. They're lovely people. They really appreciate their collections. It brings joy into their life. And I've come more at peace with the idea of, oh, well, if I sell an artwork and it brings someone pleasure and an experience and it provides me with the means to eat, so I don't have to, because I used to work at artist-run centers, and you're often overworked and underpaid, and then you don't have much time for your own art practice. And I started to realize, if I do have an income from my art practice, that's not the end of the world, because then I can actually make more work instead of... But at the same time, so I've kind of come to peace with the notion of the commodified object. I still have a it's a tense piece. It's not. Peace can be tense. I'm not completely at peace with it, but I'm closer to coming to peace with the concept of a commodified object, art object. The other dilemma. So even if I was completely at peace with this concept of a commodified art object, when you look at smaller regions outside of the urban centers, like in Atlantic Canada, we don't have a very strong art market. The province of New Brunswick has very few commercial art dealers. The city of Moncton doesn't have a single contemporary art dealer, not one. And there's a couple in Halifax. So what I see happening is there are some very fascinating, interesting artists working here in the region, making really great work that is on par with the stuff I see when I travel to larger urban centers. But because there's no contemporary art dealer here, their work doesn't get the same exposure, and people outside of the region don't know they exist. Also, art publications are important, and there's not a lot of critical writing happening in Atlantic Canada, and so you don't have people writing reviews of shows. So as a result, even the work that's shown in the artist-run centers, they don't get written about in the national art magazines. So you have the double-edged sword that they're not written about, and there's no contemporary art dealers or markets here. So we have this pool in this pocket of really interesting, unique artwork being made that's cutting edge, that's just as strong conceptually, theoretically, technically as stuff you'd see in Montreal or Toronto. But no one knows it exists because there's no market here, there's no one writing about it. And I think that's a shame. We've been working at the local level to try and find out how to remedy the problem. And then when you come to those international art fairs, even art awards like the Sobe Art Award and stuff, you still wind up with, it's the people in the centers who know the curators at the larger galleries. You often see the same people. So there's definitely this kind of dynamic that is where certain regions are more well represented than others. Like I think in the entire history of the Sobe Art Award, only 2 Francophone Acadian artists have ever even been on the long list, let alone the short list. And yet the Francophone Acadian community is very important, not only in New Brunswick, but also Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. So we have entire communities that are kind of sliding under the radar, and I think that it does come down to the fact that so much, curators, they know who they know, and some of them will go out and do studio visits outside of their region, but they too are often, they work hard and they have a lot of work, and in this region there aren't that many curators, so they don't maybe get a chance to get out as much and discover what's happening outside of their own cities. So it's kind of a lengthy, rambling response to your question, and I hope it doesn't get me in trouble. But you never know.
I'd like to actually come back to that question of career, if I may, Amanda. Mm-hmm. And I think everybody knows, but let's just remind everybody that constructing a career as an artist is hard work and complicated. I wonder if you could speak to that from your own experience.
Yeah, I would say for me, I remember when I was doing my undergrad, wondering, you're there. We used to joke that am I allowed to swear on this?
Of course.
Okay. We joked that a BFA was for a bachelor of fuck all, where you went to learn to draw unemployment, And so there was this whole question of what happens after your BFA, how do you make a living? And so while I was still doing my BFA, I started volunteering a lot at artist-run centers. So that for me was very important as a student, is to learn what happens when you leave school. How do the artist-run centers work? So I'd volunteer, running the bar, carrying chairs, lugging equipment, sitting on selection committees for getting on boards of directors of artist-run centers. I learned a lot with that. My first job after my undergrad, I was actually a receptionist at the Nova Scotia Arts Council, which in hindsight, I realized that was very, very formative for me. I was answering phones, photocopying grant applications, making coffee for juries. I really saw how the Arts Council at that time was underfunded, and you would have so many applications, so few people get funded, and I would be the one answering the phones when people were crying, yelling, saying, I took a lot of emotional stuff because people take it personally when they don't get a grant. That was very formative for me to realize when it came time for me to apply for grants that it's not personal. Like I'd seen things where, the jury wanted to fund 48 projects and there's money to fund 12. And person number 13 phones and they're crying or they're screaming at you that the jury is, they're going to call their MLA, that it's rigged against them. And yet I wasn't allowed to disclose. I had the spreadsheet in front of me and I saw they were 13 out of 250, and it's funny, I still get emotional. The arts funding system, really learning how that works, and how many amazing qualified projects are out there, and the peer assessment process, I really believe in it, and it's but it's still so hard to manage. How to get, I remember when I was in Nova Scotia, it was interdisciplinary. They'd be like, okay, we need a female Acadian dancer who's mid-career from Cape Breton, like very specific, trying to make sure to have it as equitable as possible. So that was very formative for me, learning how the granting system worked, learning to expect to maybe get 1 grant every 6 applications, to be prepared for rejection and not take it personally. It was huge. Because I've seen artists who, they apply for 2 or 3 grants, they get rejections and they're like, oh, I'm never applying again, I'll never get it, the system's rigged. And it's not, it's just really competitive because there's not enough money. And so that was very important for my career. And then learning, working at artist-run centers. So I volunteered at them, then I sat on boards, and then working as a staff member, both as a director, writing grants for an organization, and then also as a technician, supporting artists making work, helping teaching workshops. So being on that side, really seeing how a lot of people at artist-run centers are overworked and underpaid, and the importance of enabling them to maintain an art practice while working there. So then I got involved with advocacy and some of the human resource studies that were done for artists working in artist-run centers, and how to help artists maintain an active art practice while working in an artist-run center. So, and then in terms of career, it's a question of, exhibiting and promoting on the website, and being in a region like in New Brunswick, the importance of being able to travel. Like after leaving Vancouver, I lived in Amsterdam, and when I moved back to New Brunswick, I had people tell me, "Oh, Amanda, your career's just taking off. That's career suicide. You can't move to New Brunswick. You should be in Montreal or Berlin." And but I made the conscious choice. A lot of artists move away at a certain point in their career, and there's not a lot of media art, new media art being done here. So I wanted to stay and contribute and help contribute to the community here and to develop it. But in order to keep my own career moving, I had to make sure that I could still travel and go to Montreal regularly, Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver, to Europe. The only way to maintain a trajectory on my career path as an artist in New Brunswick meant that I had to make sure that I could travel to residencies in New York, in Montreal, to be able to leave the area and come back. Because if you don't live in an urban center, you need to be exposed to other people's artwork. You need to be surprised, and you need to be seen. And if you're in the same small community all year long, it's harder. So it's a privilege to be able to travel, and I recognize that it's a privilege, and I was lucky to have that privilege to be able to travel while living here. I don't know if that answers your question. It's very circuitous.
That's good. I know that the work that we have just seen here in the studio represents 9 years of work, I believe. Mm-hmm. So it's obviously a major commitment. So if you could talk a little bit about Requiem for Radio. I'd like to hear about it. Yeah.
Well, Requiem for Radio, it's a project that spans about 9 years of research and making. And there's 5 main components to it that culminated this week in a performance that integrated them all. So the first component would be New Dead Zones, which is a scale model of the radio towers site. So the Radio Canada International shortwave transmission site was located in Sackville, New Brunswick. So it's very geographically located. When I came to New Brunswick, I wanted to make work that was situated here. And so that site is very particular. It's the only site of its kind in Canada. And it broadcast around the world and on shortwave. And then it was torn down in 2014, which is a loss because we think everyone has access to the internet, but only 30% of the world is on computers. And people who live in countries with authoritarian regimes, the government can censor the internet. And even where the government doesn't censor the internet, even here, anything live streamed on Bell or CBC, the CRTC and the FCC require 30 to 40 second delay. So if something happens that they don't want to be seen, they can shut it off before the world sees it. Whereas with shortwave radio, there is not that delay. And that's why a lot of shortwave radio sites are being torn down around the world. It has, I believe, and I think a lot of people believe it has to do with controlling information. And this is a real loss because people in authoritarian regimes where they don't have access to objective news, Radio Canada International played a very big role in providing an objective source of news to people in those countries and also to people who don't have access to the internet. I think it's very narrow and short-sighted for us to think, oh, everyone has the internet. Well, not everyone can afford a computer or a digital receiver, and B, not everyone lives in an area that has access. So when the site was torn down, for me it was a loss both to the region in terms of the landmark and that kind of interesting connection to this infrastructure that was just this bizarre, beautiful web of 13 towers with red lights and wires between them. but also the international loss of this infrastructure. So I wanted to create a requiem. I sort of anthropomorphized the towers. They took on this life, so it's like mourning these towers as if they were living beings. So I created a scale model of the site out of plumbing, kind of an homage to the marshland radio plumbing project I did, which referenced the people who heard the radio in their sinks with copper pipes acted like antennas. The sink was like a gramophone speaker. So I built the entire scale model of the radio towers out of plumbing, and copper pads, dish scrubbing pads actually are the capacitance sensors, things you'd use to wash your dishes. Ran wires through them to circuits that run programming that triggers the sounds of the towers. I did recordings with contact microphones on the radio towers. And so if you touch tower H with your hand, electrons of your hand go through this wire into a circuit that send a Wi-Fi signal to a router, to a program that sends a signal back to a speaker, and it plays the sound of tower H. And if you touch tower F, it triggers the sound of tower F. And so each time you touch one of the towers, now the towers are gone, but the idea is you're playing the ghost of the radio towers. And they're recordings that I made with contact microphones, and you have to make contact with the tower to trigger that sound. So that's New Dead Zones, and it exists as an installation that the public can touch. It premiered at Nocturne in Halifax. At that point it was very popular, which was great, but the problem was that everyone was always touching it, and they're tuned like a scale, so it was as if someone was leaning on a keyboard touching all the notes at once. So in the performance here, I worked with musicians, and there were 3 of us, and we played them as a musical instrument. Second component is pulse decay, which is a piece for a theremin. And I liked the idea of the theremin as a conjuring device. It's very magical, you don't touch it, you have antennas. And I wanted to play the ghosts of the antennas with antennas. So when in pulse decay, I have control voltage running into an Arduino that triggers video and audio of the radio towers. So from that one theremin, you can play all of the radio towers. Then another part in Requiem for Radio is called Radio Cowers. It's about the cows that lived around the radio towers. And I took a cow bone from a cow that actually lived near the towers, consulted with a master bow maker, learned how to make a violin or a cello bow. And so with white Siberian horsehair and a cow bone, I made a bow out of a bone. And I ran that, I played a cello with this bone and ran it through a 1938 Marconi radio. So it's a floor model shortwave radio. And the radio towers were built, they started building them around 1938. So the actual radio that I'm using is historically accurate to the era the towers were built. And in the performance, that's at the moment of the Dies Irae of the Requiem, which is all about hell and judgment and doom and bones and fire. And in that part of the performance, I'm playing with an actual bone of a dead cow that lived by the radio towers, and I'm screaming into the sound holes of the cello and running it through a 1938 radio. And then the next part was Deviant Receptions, where I tried this thing that was a little crazy. I worked with a composer, Lucas Pierce. I hired him to create a 5-channel sound piece. I recorded a local choir here in Moncton singing William Byrd's Kyrie from the Requiem, and recorded each voice separately. And Lucas made this sound piece that converts the Requiem into Morse code, and he uses my sound recordings of the towers and plays it out, stretches it out to 1 hour. And it's a 5-channel piece, but instead of doing 5.1 surround with 5 speakers, I bought airtime from 5 different countries. So you had the soprano being broadcast from Austria, the alto being broadcast from Germany, a tenor being broadcast from Maine, another tenor being broadcast from Monticello, and the bass being broadcast by a pirate, who I can't say where he's from. In fact, I don't even know where he's from. So I coordinated 5 different shortwave stations around the world to each broadcast a track of that piece towards the Aberdeen Centre here in Moncton at the same time, which is close enough to the Radio Canada International site that they were essentially broadcasting to the fallen Radio Canada International towers. And we had 5 radios, and during the performance we tuned in to recombine that piece. And in the piece I also got the broadcasters from each of those stations to read their station ID, but I sent them a script and they recorded themselves saying, this is WBCQ Free Speech Radio, calling RCI, come in RCI, where are you? This is German Shortwave Service, calling RCI, come in RCI, where are you, where are you? And I wanted this idea that all these international shortwave towers around the world were calling out to their fallen sister site. So it was as if the technology was lamenting the death of the technology. So to kind of take the humans out of the equation and to personify these shortwave transmission sites, I wasn't sure if it would work, and it did. We had 3 nights. We recombined the piece in the theater, but even more amazingly, people around the world, the shortwave community is fascinating. Every day I'm getting more what they call reception reports of people who heard that broadcast. They didn't know what it was. They're like, what is this? And now they want me to send them QSL cards, which I have. But I've gotten people in China, Russia, Italy, Germany, Austria, all over the United States who either heard one channel or they set 4 or 5 radios up in their house and tried to get them all. So the performance, Requiem for Radio, Full Quiet Flutter, which used all of those elements. There were 3 of us live on stage, playing the sculpture as a musical instrument, playing the theremin to trigger video, screaming into a cello with a cowbone, tuning radios. That performance happened here in the space. But then all around the world, people were tuning in to fragments of the performance, and they heard things that people in the theater didn't hear, and people in the theater heard things that people tuning to the radio didn't hear. And I think there was some, and because it's not the internet, because it was all shortwave, there's no delay. It was all immediate, and I really find that that's something so beautiful, that it's a technology from about 100 years ago, and there's even more immediacy than what we're using today on laptops. And to me, there's something very important and beautiful and magical about it, and it's also incredibly political at the same time. So I was aiming to create an emotional and magical sense of wonder while also making a very strong political statement.